Fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps above my head. Sweat dripped down my spine, cold and sharp, as my eyes snapped open to the hum of the airport terminal. I was supposed to be dead. Instead, I was sitting at gate B12, holding 4 first-class tickets I'd paid for, watching my family pack their bags to abandon me. Again, only this time, I wasn't going to beg them to stay. I was going to let them walk away. And then, I was going to ruin their vacation. Bile rose in the back of my throat, tasting vividly of copper and cheap airplane coffee. I dug a jagged thumbnail into the fleshy part of my palm until a bead of blood welled up, stinging sharply against the dry, recycled oxygen of JFK Terminal 4. The pain grounded me. It wasn't a dream. The phantom sensation of crushed metal, shattered glass, and the smell of leaking gasoline from my past life was fading, replaced by the mundane scent of industrial floor wax and stale pretzel salt. I was back, November 14th, 3 years before the accident that would rip my lungs apart. 3 years before I died entirely alone, while the people standing in front of me ignored my calls from a hospital bed. "Nora, are you even listening to me?" My father's voice. "Arthur." It cut through the roaring in my ears like a serrated knife. I blinked heavily, the harsh glare of the terminal windows stabbing my retinas. He was standing there with his leather weekender bag slung over one shoulder, wearing that disappointed, heavy-lidded expression he always reserved just for me. "I said," he sighed, dragging a hand down his face. "Chloe needs this. You know how fragile her nerves are right now. Toby surprised her, and it's their first real anniversary. You can't honestly expect her to sit in first class while her boyfriend is stuck in economy, can you?" I slowly shifted my gaze. Next to my father stood my stepmother, Diane, radiating a cloying cloud of expensive gin and patchouli. She was aggressively filing her nails, refusing to look at me, her posture screaming boredom. And then there was Chloe, my stepsister. She was leaning against her oversized Louis Vuitton luggage, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with the sleeve of her cashmere sweater, her bottom lip shoved out in a practiced, trembling pout. Next to her stood Toby, a guy who owned 3 skateboards and 0 bank accounts, looking vaguely uncomfortable, but entirely willing to accept a free $10,000 flight to Geneva. In my last life, this exact moment broke me. I had worked 80-hour weeks for a year to fund this luxury family ski trip. I had bought the first-class pods. I had booked the chalets. And right here, 30 minutes before boarding, they demanded I give my ticket to Toby and take a standby economy seat on a flight the next morning. When I had cried and begged them not to leave me behind, they called me selfish. They called me unhinged. They boarded the plane, drank complimentary champagne, and left me sobbing on the dirty carpet of gate B12. I eventually bought a miserable red-eye ticket, arrived in Switzerland exhausted, and spent the entire week paying for their dinners while they mocked my martyr complex. My chest heaved. A messy, jagged breath scraped its way out of my throat. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat against my thighs to hide the tremors. I wasn't some stoic, icy protagonist from a movie. I was terrified. My entire body felt bruised from a death that hadn't happened yet, and the emotional whiplash of seeing them alive, breathing, and looking at me with such profound disdain was enough to make me want to vomit into the nearest trash can. "Nora, please," Chloe whined, her voice pitchy and grating. "Don't make a scene. It's just one night. You're always so obsessed with logistics. You don't care about anyone's feelings. Toby will be miserable in the back of the plane. Your sister is right, Diane chimed in, finally blowing the dust off her freshly filed nail. You're acting incredibly rigid, darling. Just go to the desk, downgrade your ticket, and we'll see you at the chalet tomorrow. It builds character. I looked at the three of them. I looked at the way my father avoided my eyes, staring instead at the departures board. He was my blood. He had watched me sacrifice my youth to keep his failing business afloat. And now he was willingly discarding me so his stepdaughter could play house in the Alps. A strange, dark laugh bubbled up in my chest. It felt foreign, scratching against my ribs. I swallowed it down, leaving only a bitter smile on my lips. Okay, I said. My voice cracked. I cleared my throat and tried again, softer this time. Okay, you're right. My father's shoulders dropped in immediate relief. Thank God. I knew you'd be reasonable, Nora. I'll make sure Chloe pays you back for the ticket. A lie. She never did. Just leave your bags here, Diane instructed breezily, already turning toward the priority boarding lane. We don't have enough hands to carry your ski gear anyway. You can check it tomorrow. They didn't even say goodbye. Chloe linked arms with Toby, giggling as they practically skipped toward the gate agent. Diane followed, her heels clicking against the linoleum in a sharp, rhythmic tempo. Arthur lingered for half a second, gave me a tight, awkward pat on the shoulder that felt more like a shove, and muttered, "Safe travels, kiddo." I sat perfectly still on the stiff, faux leather chair. The cold draft from the jet bridge washed over my face as I watched them hand their passports to the attendant. My heart hammered against my sternum, frantic and heavy. Decades of ingrained desperation, the pathetic, clawing need for my father's love, screamed at me to stand up, to run after them, to apologize for being an inconvenience. My vision blurred. A single, pathetic tear spilled over my lashes, hot and humiliating. I wiped it away violently with the back of my hand, smearing my mascara. No, not this time. As they disappeared down the tunnel, leaving me completely alone, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. The cold metal edge dug into my palm. It was time to pull the plug. Heavy silence seemed to wrap around me, muting the chaotic symphony of the airport. The rolling of suitcases, the muffled announcements over the intercom, the crying toddlers, all of it faded into a dull roar. My fingers were slick with sweat as I unlocked my phone. The screen glared back at me, displaying the airline's app. Confirmation, K92BXT, 4 passengers. Status, boarding. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was such a small gesture, a few taps on a piece of glass. Yet, my entire body was resisting. A lifetime of conditioning doesn't just evaporate because you want it to. My stomach churned with nausea, and for a split second, I almost locked the phone. What if they hate me forever? What if Arthur never speaks to me again? I squeezed my eyes shut, and suddenly, the sterile smell of the hospital room from my past life hit me. The rhythmic, agonizing beep of the heart monitor, the absolute certainty that I was dying, and the crushing realization that nobody was coming. My eyes flew open. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow clarity. I tapped Manage Booking. I tapped Modify Passengers. The app loaded, a tiny blue circle spinning lazily. It felt like an eternity. Finally, the names populated. Arthur, Diane, Chloe. Toby wasn't even on the itinerary. Chloe was flying on my ticket under my name, assuming the gate agents wouldn't check too closely during the boarding rush, or that Arthur would charm them into allowing a name change at the desk. I had bought these tickets. My credit card was tethered to every single barcode they had just scanned. I selected all 4 names. I hit Cancel Itinerary. A pop-up appeared, warning me that canceling after scanning would invalidate the boarding passes immediately and incur a penalty fee. I laughed, a dry, wretched sound that made a passing businessman shoot me a weird look. I hit Confirm. The screen flashed green. Your itinerary has been successfully canceled. A flight credit will be issued to the primary cardholder. The tension in my shoulders snapped. I slumped back against the awful chair, dragging a shaky breath into my lungs. It was done. They were currently walking down the jet bridge. In about 40 seconds, they were going to reach the flight attendants at the plane door, and their digital passes were going to flash bright, angry red. I didn't stick around to watch the fallout from the terminal window. I stood up, grabbing my heavy duffel bag. My legs felt like they were made of lead, trembling with every step, but I forced myself to walk. I didn't head toward the exit. Instead, I pulled up a luxury concierge app I had downloaded years ago, but never dared to use, because I was too busy saving money for my family's endless demands. Charter request, JFK to Geneva, solo passenger, immediate departure. The quoted price made my eyes water, $85,000. It was a massive chunk of my savings. It was irresponsible. It was glorious. I double-tapped the side button on my phone, authorized the payment, and felt a manic, unhinged thrill ripple through my chest. Leaving Terminal 4 felt like shedding a physical weight. I dragged my bag out into the biting November air, flagging down a black car to take me to the fixed base operator terminal across the tarmac. The transition was jarring. 1 minute, I was surrounded by the anxiety-soaked chaos of commercial travel, and the next, I was stepping into a hushed, mahogany-paneled oasis. There were no crying children here, no smell of despair or cheap hot dogs, just the scent of leather, orchids, and expensive Earl Grey tea. A polite attendant in a sharp suit took my duffel bag immediately, offering me a warm towel and a quiet corner to wait while the crew prepped the Challenger 350. I sank into a plush armchair, the leather cool and soft against my skin. I reached for the glass of sparkling water on the side table, but my hand was shaking so badly I knocked the rim against my teeth, spilling cold water down my chin. I cursed, wiping it away with my sleeve, feeling incredibly small, despite the luxury surrounding me. I was a mess. Then, my phone vibrated. Once, twice, 5 times in rapid succession. I stared at the screen sitting on the table. The notifications were piling up like a car crash. Arthur. Nora, what did you do? The gate agent is saying our tickets are invalid. Arthur. Answer the phone. Chloe. OMG, Nora. You psycho bitch. They literally just pulled us out of the boarding line. Fix this now. Diane. Nora, this is not funny. Arthur is having a blood pressure spike. Call the airline immediately. Arthur. They are telling us the entire booking was canceled. We have no seats. What the hell is going on? I picked up the phone. The cool glass felt different now. Empowering. I watched the bubbles rise in my sparkling water, listening to the soft, classical music playing in the private lounge. I typed out a single, deliberate reply to the group chat. Nora, you told me to downgrade and deal with the logistics. I did. I canceled the tickets. Have fun building character in economy tomorrow. I'm going to Geneva. I hit send. Then, I turned the phone off, dropped it into my bag, and closed my eyes. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I could finally breathe. Vibrations rattled through the soles of my boots as the Challenger 350 tore down the runway, pressing a heavy, invisible hand against my chest. I stared out the oval window, watching the gray, sprawling concrete of JFK blur into streaks of muted lights. We broke through the dense November cloud cover, and suddenly the cabin was flooded with piercing, unfiltered sunlight. I slammed the window shade down. It was too bright. I wasn't ready for the light yet. Silence at 40,000 feet sounds different than silence on the ground. It's a pressurized, hollow hum that presses against your eardrums. Bethany, a flight attendant with flawlessly pinned back blonde hair and a discreet smile, moved through the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a ghost. She placed a warmed porcelain plate of roasted almonds and a fresh espresso on the walnut table beside me, stepping back without making a sound. I stared at the almonds, the scent of toasted nuts and rich, dark coffee mixed with the faint smell of jet fuel and leather. It was intoxicating. It was also deeply nauseating. My stomach gave a violent lurch, rejecting the sudden shift from agonizing stress to absolute luxury. I grabbed the heavy linen napkin, pressing it over my mouth as I leaned forward, squeezing my eyes shut until the wave of sickness passed. I was doing this. I had actually done it. I unbuckled my seatbelt, my fingers fumbling with the heavy metal clasp. The fabric of my cheap, oversized sweater clung to my sweaty skin. I felt like a fraud sitting in this cabin. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I pushed myself out of the wide leather seat and walked toward the small lavatory at the back, my stockinged feet sinking into the thick, cream-colored carpet. Inside the tiny bathroom, I locked the door and braced my hands against the edges of the marble sink. I looked in the mirror. Staring back at me was a 32-year-old woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a decade. My dark hair was pulled into a messy, greasy knot at the nape of my neck. My skin was sallow, bruised with deep purple half-moons under my eyes. I looked nothing like the polished, aggressive woman who had just dropped 85 grand on a private flight to spite her family. I looked exactly like the exhausted, shattered girl who had bled out on a rain-slicked highway 3 years in the future. A sudden, phantom pain flared in my chest, right where the steering column had crushed my ribs. I gasped, a harsh, ugly sound, and gripped the edge of the sink so hard my knuckles popped. The smell of copper and gasoline flooded my nostrils again. So vivid, I gagged into the polished steel basin. "Stop," I whispered to my reflection. My voice was raspy, broken. "You're alive. You're here." "They aren't." I turned on the faucet, letting the water run ice cold. I cupped it in my trembling hands and splashed it over my face, shivering as the freezing droplets soaked into the collar of my sweater. I grabbed a thick cotton towel, patting my skin dry. The rough texture grounded me. The smell of high-end lavender soap replaced the phantom gasoline. I took a deep, shuddering breath, unlocked the door, and walked back into the cabin. For the first 3 hours of the flight, I sat perfectly still, staring at the muted television screen, playing some meaningless documentary about ocean life. I ate a piece of seared salmon that tasted like ash in my mouth. I drank 2 glasses of heavily oaked Chardonnay that burned the back of my throat, hoping it would knock me out. It didn't. It just made my brain buzz with a sharper, more frantic energy. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the suffocating quiet became too much. I needed the noise. I needed the reality of what I had set in motion. I reached into my duffel bag and pulled out my phone. I connected to the jet's onboard Wi-Fi. The screen immediately froze for a solid 10 seconds as the notifications flooded in. A digital avalanche of rage. 84 unread text messages, 12 missed calls, 5 voicemails. I opened the voicemails first. My father's voice filled my ear, no longer playing the disappointed patriarch. He was frantic. "Nora, pick up the goddamn phone. The desk agent is telling me the tickets are gone. Completely gone. You can't just cancel a holiday because you're throwing a tantrum. Chloe is hyperventilating in the bathroom. Do you have any idea how much a last-minute flight costs right now? Call me back and give me your credit card number immediately." The next voicemail was from Diane. Her usually smooth, gin-soaked voice was sharp and shrill. "You little bitch. We are sitting on our luggage in the food court. Arthur is trying to get a loan approved on his phone to buy economy tickets for tomorrow morning. You are going to pay for this, Nora. Every single cent. When we get to that chalet, you are packing your bags and leaving. Do you hear me?" I lowered the phone. A hollow ache spread through my ribs, cold and deep. There was no concern for where I was. There was no question of why I had snapped. There was only panic about the money, only rage that their endless, bottomless ATM had finally closed its doors. In my past life, those voicemails would have broken me. I would have called the airline sobbing, begging to reinstate the tickets, paying whatever exorbitant fees they demanded, just to make my father's voice soften again. Now, sitting in a leather pod 30,000 feet in the air, I just felt tired, a bone-deep, marrow-sucking exhaustion. I deleted the voicemails without listening to the rest. I opened my banking app, transferred the refunded flight credit into a private, high-yield account they didn't know existed, and then I blocked all of their numbers, every single one. I tossed the phone onto the empty seat across from me. I pulled the cashmere blanket up to my chin, closed my eyes, and listened to the steady, unyielding roar of the jet engines until I finally fell into a dreamless sleep. Frost coated the edges of the tinted windows of the Mercedes Sprinter van, blurring the jagged, imposing silhouettes of the Swiss Alps. The tires crunched rhythmically over the packed snow, a sound that sent a strange, satisfying shiver up my spine. It was a viciously cold morning in Verbier. The air outside was thin and sharp, carrying the faint, smoky scent of burning pine from the village below. I leaned my head against the cold glass, watching the sun drag itself over the mountain peaks, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. My body felt heavy, sluggish from the altitude and the residual wine, but my mind was violently awake. "We are here, miss," the driver said, his voice thick with a French accent. He shifted the heavy vehicle into park, the engine rumbling to a quiet idle. I sat up, peering through the windshield. The chalet was massive, a sprawling structure of dark, weathered wood and massive sheets of reinforced glass, clinging to the side of the mountain like a predator watching its territory. 3 stories of wrap-around balconies, a steaming outdoor hot tub overlooking the valley. I had booked this place 8 months ago. I had negotiated the rate, wired the deposit, and spent weeks planning the grocery delivery. In my previous life, I arrived here at midnight, dragging my own luggage up the steep driveway because the others had taken the private transfer hours earlier. I had walked into a house littered with empty champagne bottles and discarded ski gear. Chloe and Toby had claimed the top-floor master suite with the panoramic views and the stone fireplace. Arthur and Diane took the second-floor guest suite. They had left me the basement room, a windowless, drafty box right next to the noisy mechanical room that hummed aggressively all night. I hadn't complained. I had just been grateful they were speaking to me again. The driver opened my door, and the freezing air hit me like a physical blow. It stung my cheeks and immediately dried out my throat. I loved it. It felt like an exorcism. I tipped the driver heavily, grabbed my single duffel bag, and walked up the stone steps to the heavy oak door. I punched in the keypad code. The lock clicked, a heavy, satisfying sound. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The silence of the empty chalet was absolute. The air inside was warm, smelling of cedar, expensive citrus floor polish, and the faint, dusty scent of a dormant fireplace. I dropped my bag on the slate tiles of the entryway. The thud echoed up to the vaulted ceiling. I walked slowly into the main living area. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the jagged snow-capped mountains perfectly. It looked like a painting. I ran my fingers over the back of the massive leather sofa, feeling the cold, smooth hide. I walked into the kitchen, opening the Sub-Zero refrigerator. It was fully stocked. Rows of sparkling water, fresh local cheeses, cured meats, and expensive bottles of wine. Everything I had paid for. Everything they had expected to consume while ignoring me. I closed the fridge and walked toward the floating oak staircase. I didn't stop at the basement door. I didn't stop on the second floor. I climbed all the way to the top, my boots thudding softly against the wood. I pushed open the door to the master suite. It was breathtaking. A massive, king-sized bed, covered in thick, faux wolf fur blankets, sat in the center of the room, facing a wall of glass that looked out over the valley. A stone fireplace stretched from the floor to the ceiling. The ensuite bathroom had a freestanding copper tub. I walked over to the bed, dropping my coat onto the floor. I sat on the edge of the mattress. It was obscenely soft. I reached out, running my hand over the thick, soft fibers of the fur blanket. This was mine. I had bought it with the hours of my life I traded away in a windowless office. A sudden, sharp laugh clawed its way out of my throat. It bounced off the glass walls, sounding slightly manic. The laughter dissolved into a heavy, ragged sigh. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, and rested my chin on my knees. The euphoria of the airport was fading, leaving behind a stark, terrifying reality. I had drawn the line in the sand, but cutting off a rotten limb doesn't mean you don't bleed. My family was terrible. They were selfish, narcissistic, and cruel, but they were all I had known. For 32 years, my entire identity had been wrapped up in trying to earn my father's nod of approval, in trying to prove to Diane that I wasn't just the leftover baggage from Arthur's first marriage. Without that desperate, clawing need, the silence of this massive room felt deafening. I was completely, utterly alone. I let my forehead rest against my knees. I didn't cry. I had cried enough in my last life to fill that copper bathtub. Instead, I just sat there, listening to the wind howl against the reinforced glass, waiting for the trembling in my hands to stop. They would be arriving tomorrow. They would take the cheapest budget airline they could find, rent a terrible car, and drive up this mountain, expecting to bulldoze me into submission. They expected me to be in the basement, crying, ready to hand over my credit card to make amends. I lifted my head, looking at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The bruised, exhausted girl from the airplane bathroom was still there, but her eyes were different. They were hard, cold as the air outside. Let them come. I had a fireplace to light and a copper tub to fill. Sunlight hit the slate floor of the kitchen in sharp, blinding geometric blocks. I stood barefoot on the heated stone, letting the warmth seep up through my arches, while the espresso machine hissed and spat dark liquid into a ceramic mug. The smell of roasted beans and caramelized sugar cut through the faint scent of cedarwood in altitude. It was just past 11 in the morning. I had been awake since 4. Sleep hadn't come easy, despite the obscenely soft mattress upstairs. Every time I closed my eyes, my brain projected a frantic, jagged reel of my past life's final days. The sterile white ceiling of the ICU, the agonizing pressure in my lungs, the absolute hollow silence of my cell phone sitting on the bedside table, devoid of any messages from the people I had spent my entire life bankrupting myself for. My body was holding on to a trauma that technically hadn't happened yet, leaving my nervous system vibrating like a plucked wire. I took a sip of the espresso. It was bitter, leaving a sharp, acidic coating on my tongue. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down the winding, ice-slicked mountain road. They were coming. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones. I had spent the early morning doing something I had never dared to do in my previous 32 years of existence. I established a perimeter. I logged into the chalet's guest portal on my tablet and changed the digital keypad code on the front door. Then, I called the property management office and explicitly informed them that no additional guests were authorized on the premises under my reservation. My voice had shaken when I said it, but the concierge simply replied with a polite, Swiss-accented affirmation. Now, I was just waiting. I was wearing a pair of thick wool leggings and an oversized cashmere sweater I had bought for Chloe last Christmas, a sweater she had discarded in the back of her closet because the color washed her out. It felt incredibly soft against my skin. It felt like armor. At 11:40, a sound broke the pristine mountain silence. It wasn't the smooth, heavy purr of a luxury transfer van. It was the high-pitched, strained whine of a cheap, subcompact engine fighting a losing battle against the steep incline. I set my mug down on the granite counter. My stomach instantly seized, twisting into a tight, agonizing knot of pure acid. My pulse hammered against the base of my throat so hard it actually hurt. A lifetime of Pavlovian conditioning screamed at me to run to the door, to apologize, to smooth over the edges of their inevitable rage. A dirty, silver Skoda hatchback crested the driveway, its tires spinning aggressively on a patch of black ice before gripping the pavement. The front bumper was crusted with gray slush. The car jerked to a violent halt near the stone steps. Through the tinted glass of the chalet, I watched them spill out. Arthur emerged from the driver's side first. His face was a mottled, furious red, his hair uncharacteristically disheveled. He was wearing his expensive Moncler ski jacket, but underneath, his clothes looked slept-in and wrinkled. Diane climbed out of the passenger side, her expression pinched and venomous, clutching a massive designer tote bag to her chest, like a shield. Chloe and Toby crawled out of the back seat, looking miserable, exhausted, and deeply hungover. They looked exactly like people who had spent the last 18 hours sitting in middle seats near the lavatory on a budget airline. My hands began to tremble. I pressed them flat against the cold granite countertop, taking a sharp, jagged breath. Show them nothing, I told myself. You are not the girl who died alone. Outside, Arthur marched up the stone steps, dragging a wheeled suitcase that bounced violently against the masonry. He didn't even look at the view. He didn't look at the house. He just marched straight to the heavy oak front door and aggressively punched his finger into the keypad. Beep, 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 beep. Error. A harsh red light flashed on the panel. Arthur froze. He leaned back, glaring at the keypad as if it had personally insulted him, and punched the numbers in again, faster this time. Error. God damn it, Nora. His voice was muffled through the thick glass and heavy wood, but the fury behind it was palpable. He slammed his flat palm against the door. Open this door right now. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, 40 feet away, watching his shadow warp against the frosted glass of the entryway. My lungs felt tight, restricting my breath to shallow, painful gasps. I was terrified. He was my father. He had loomed over my entire life, like a shadow, dictating my worth based entirely on my usefulness to him. Diane's voice pierced the cold air next. Step aside, Arthur. You're hitting the wrong buttons. I watched her shadow replace his. More beeping. Another red light. Then came the furious, sustained pounding. Nora, I know you're in there. Chloe's shrill voice joined the chorus. She was kicking the bottom of the door with her boots. Open the door, you psycho. It is freezing out here. I closed my eyes. The smell of hospital antiseptic washed over my memory, erasing the scent of espresso. I remembered the cold, clinical voice of the nurse telling me my emergency contacts were going straight to voicemail. My eyes snapped open. The terror in my chest crystallized, hardening into something sharp, jagged, and infinitely cold. I pushed away from the counter. My bare feet made no sound on the stone tiles as I walked through the sprawling living room toward the entryway. The pounding grew louder, more frantic. Toby was shouting something now, his voice cracking. I reached the oak door. I didn't look through the peephole. I didn't hesitate. I reached out, grabbed the heavy iron deadbolt, and twisted it with a loud, metallic clack. I pulled the door open. Freezing wind rushed through the doorway, carrying the metallic scent of snow and the sour, stale smell of airplane sweat. I stood in the threshold, blocking the entrance. Arthur's hand was raised, curled into a fist, ready to hammer against the wood again. He dropped it when he saw me, his chest heaving under his expensive jacket. His eyes were bloodshot, completely devoid of any paternal warmth. There was no relief that I was safe. There was only the seething, bubbling entitlement of a man whose wallet had suddenly snapped shut. What the hell is wrong with you? Arthur snarled, his voice thick with spittle. He took a heavy step forward, expecting me to immediately shrink back and let him pass. I didn't move. I planted my feet firmly on the slate tile, forcing him to halt on the exterior doormat. Do you have any idea what you put us through? Diane pushed her way to the front, her usually immaculate makeup smeared underneath her eyes. She smelled like stale gin and desperation. We had to fly standby on a budget carrier out of Newark. Newark, Nora. Toby threw up in the rental car. Chloe has been crying for 24 hours. You are completely unhinged. Move out of the way, Chloe snapped, shoving past her mother. She dragged her oversized Louis Vuitton bag toward the door, her face pale and furious. I am going straight to the master suite and taking a bath. And then we are having a very serious conversation about how you are going to reimburse Toby for his pain and suffering. She stepped forward, lifting her bag to carry it over the threshold. I reached out and shoved my open palm flat against the center of her chest. I didn't push hard, but the sudden, completely unexpected physical boundary shocked her so deeply, she stumbled backward, her boots slipping on the icy stone. Toby had to grab her elbow to keep her from falling down the steps. "Don't touch me!" Chloe shrieked, her voice echoing off the surrounding mountains. She looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. "You aren't coming in," I said. My voice was quiet. It wasn't the booming, authoritative roar of a movie hero. It was shaky, raspy from disuse, and barely louder than the wind whipping through the pine trees. But the absolute finality of the words caused a sudden, jarring silence to fall over the porch. Arthur stared at me, his jaw slackening in pure disbelief. "Excuse me? You aren't coming in," I repeated, forcing my vocal cords to steady. I looked directly into my father's eyes, ignoring the violent churning in my gut. "This chalet is under my name. I paid for the deposit. I paid for the rental. I canceled your flights, and I canceled your free ride." Arthur's face transitioned from red to a dangerous, mottled purple. "You little brat, I am your father. You do not speak to me this way. You threw a tantrum at the airport. Fine. You made your point. Now get out of the doorway before I lose my temper completely." He stepped forward again, towering over me. The physical intimidation was a tactic he had used since I was 8 years old. It used to make me fold like wet paper. I used to physically shrink, apologizing frantically to avoid his wrath. I felt my shoulders tense, the muscle memory of submission pulling at my spine. But then I looked at his hands, balled into fists by his sides. I looked at the way he was perfectly willing to freeze me out of a vacation I had funded, just to appease his stepdaughter. "Lose your temper," I whispered, leaning an inch closer to him. "See what it gets you." Diane let out a harsh, incredulous scoff. "Arthur, don't listen to this dramatic nonsense. She's just trying to extort an apology. Nora, stop being ridiculous. Move. The keypad code has been changed," I said, ignoring Diane entirely. "The property management team has a copy of my ID and the credit card on file. If any of you attempt to force your way through this door, I will press the panic button in the kitchen, and the private estate security will be here in less than 4 minutes to arrest you for trespassing." "You wouldn't dare," Chloe spat, though her voice wavered. She was shivering now, her thin cashmere sweater doing nothing against the biting Swiss wind. "I watched you walk down a jet bridge and leave me at an airport after I worked 80 hours a week for a year to buy you those tickets," I said, my voice finally dropping its tremor, turning cold and flat. "You don't know what I dare to do anymore." Arthur stared at me, really stared at me. For the first time in my entire life, I saw something shift behind his eyes. It wasn't love. It wasn't respect. It was the sudden, horrifying realization that the leash had snapped. He couldn't control me anymore, and he knew it. "You're a sick girl, Nora," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, venomous sneer. "You have always been deeply disturbed. If you do this, if you close this door on your family, you are dead to me. Do you understand? I will never forgive this." The words hit me right in the center of my chest. A phantom ache, a ghost of the girl who used to desperately crave his affection, flared up and died instantly. "I've already been dead," I replied quietly. "It wasn't that bad." Before he could process the sheer absurdity of the statement, I stepped back into the warmth of the hallway. I didn't wait to see the expressions on their faces. I grabbed the heavy iron handle of the oak door and pulled it shut. The latch clicked firmly into place. I threw the deadbolt. Outside, a second of absolute silence passed, and then the screaming started. Fists pounded against the wood. Chloe wailed. Arthur shouted obscenities that rattled the frosted glass. I stood in the entryway, my back pressed against the door, feeling the vibrations of their rage thump against my spine. I sank slowly to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and pressed my hands over my face. I was shaking so violently, my teeth chattered. Tears, hot, ugly, and entirely unheroic, spilled over my palms and soaked into the collar of my sweater. I cried for the 32 years I had wasted on them. I cried for the girl who had died alone on a highway, and as the sound of the rental car engine eventually roared to life and faded down the mountain, I took a deep, shuddering breath of cedar-scented air and finally began to live. Adrenaline is a finite resource. When it finally drained out of my bloodstream, it left behind a hollow, agonizing husk. I remained curled on the slate floor of the entryway for a long time, listening to the erratic, frantic thud of my own heartbeat. The heavy oak door against my spine was solid, unyielding. It felt like a gravestone marking the end of a very long, very pathetic era of my existence. Slowly, the biting chill of the stone tiles seeped through my leggings, forcing my stiff joints into motion. I pushed myself up. My muscles trembled, weak and completely uncoordinated, as if I had just survived a physical beating, rather than a 5-minute conversation. I didn't look out the expansive windows. I didn't want to see the jagged tire tracks their cheap rental car had undoubtedly carved into the pristine snow of the driveway. I wanted the outside world to cease entirely. I left my heavy duffel bag slumped by the door and walked upstairs, my hand trailing along the smooth, polished oak of the banister. The silence in the massive chalet was no longer deafening. It was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders. I felt like an intruder in a museum. Inside the master bathroom, the air was freezing. The floor-to-ceiling frosted window overlooked a jagged cliff face, letting in a muted, grayish-blue twilight. I walked over to the freestanding copper tub positioned in the center of the room. It was deep enough to drown in. I turned the heavy brass handles. Water violently sputtered from the faucet before smoothing into a thick, steaming cascade. While the tub filled, I stripped off the oversized cashmere sweater and the wool leggings, letting them pool on the heated tile floor in a careless heap. I stood naked in front of the massive vanity mirror. I expected to see a monster, a cruel, ungrateful daughter. That was the narrative, wasn't it? But the reflection staring back was just a deeply exhausted woman. I raised a trembling hand and traced the skin over my ribcage. Right there, on the left side, was where the steering column had shattered my bones in the accident that hadn't happened yet. I pressed my fingertips into the soft flesh, pushing hard, half expecting to feel the jagged, agonizing grind of splintered bone. There was nothing, just the steady, rhythmic expansion of healthy lungs. I traced the line of my jaw, searching for the jagged, angry red scar the shattered windshield had left behind in the ICU smooth skin, unblemished. A ragged, ugly sob tore its way up my throat. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle it, biting down on the fleshy part of my palm. I was crying for a body that hadn't been broken yet. I was mourning a death nobody else knew about. The psychological whiplash was tearing me apart at the seams. The water in the tub reached the overflow drain. I turned off the brass taps, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. The room was thick with dense, fragrant steam, smelling faintly of the mineral-rich mountain water. I climbed into the copper basin. The water was scalding, biting into my cold skin with a fierce, burning intensity that made me gasp. I sank down until the water lapped against my collarbones. It felt like an incubator. It felt safe. I leaned my head back against the sloping, metallic edge, closing my eyes. I wanted to feel triumphant. I wanted to revel in the petty, cinematic revenge of leaving them stranded in the cold. But I didn't feel like a mastermind. I felt nauseous. Arthur's final words echoed in the tiled room. "You are dead to me. I will never forgive this." For 32 years, my brain had been hardwired to view his forgiveness as the ultimate, unattainable currency. I had paid his mortgage when his logistics company nearly filed for bankruptcy. I had funded Chloe's useless 6-year liberal arts degree. I had bought Diane's silence with endless streams of designer bags and luxury spa retreats. I had bought this entire vacation just to earn a seat at their table, and it took exactly one canceled flight for him to declare me dead. I opened my eyes, staring through the rising steam at the wooden rafters above. My chest tightened, the familiar, suffocating panic rising in my throat. What was I going to do now? My entire identity was built around being useful to them. Without the desperate, clawing need to be loved by Arthur, I was just a woman sitting in a tub of hot water, completely alone in a foreign country. I let myself slide lower, the scalding water rushing over my ears, muting the howl of the wind outside. Underneath the surface, the silence was absolute. I held my breath, feeling the frantic pounding of my heart against my ribs. I stayed under until my lungs began to burn, until the primal, biological urge to survive overpowered the heavy, crushing weight of my depression. I broke the surface, gasping for the cold, cedar-scented air, water streaming down my face. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wet hand. I was alive. They had left me to die once, and I wasn't going to spend this second chance mourning people who were still breathing. I climbed out of the tub, shivering violently as the cold air hit my flushed skin. I wrapped myself in a massive, obscenely thick white towel. It was time to burn the rest of the bridge. Hunger woke me just after 8 in the evening. Not the polite, easily ignored rumbling of a skipped lunch, but a vicious, hollow cramp that clawed at the lining of my empty stomach. I had fallen asleep, wrapped in a heavy faux wolf fur blanket on the master bed, completely drained. The chalet was pitch black, save for the faint, silvery illumination of the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. I didn't bother turning on the overhead lights. I padded down the floating oak staircase barefoot, guided by the ambient glow spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the kitchen, I opened the massive, sub-zero refrigerator. The harsh LED light made my eyes water. Sitting on the middle shelf, wrapped in butcher paper, were 4 prime Wagyu ribeyes I had ordered specifically because Arthur considered himself a connoisseur of expensive meat. I pulled one out. I didn't want a salad. I didn't want toast. I wanted to consume something rich, bloody, and outrageously expensive. I threw a heavy cast-iron skillet onto the gas range, twisting the dial until blue flames licked the sides of the metal. I dropped a massive knob of cultured butter into the pan. It hissed and popped violently, the kitchen immediately filling with the rich, nutty aroma of browning fat. I seasoned the steak aggressively with coarse sea salt and cracked pepper, dropping it into the smoking pan. The searing hiss was deafening. Smoke curled up toward the vaulted ceiling. I stood over the stove, flipping the meat with a pair of metal tongs, watching the crust form perfectly. I poured a glass of heavy, robust Cabernet from an open bottle on the counter and drank a quarter of it in one long, burning swallow. I ate the steak standing at the kitchen island, slicing it into bloody strips and eating it straight off the wooden cutting board. I didn't use a napkin. I let the juice drip down my chin, wiping it away with the back of my hand. It was feral. It was incredibly satisfying. When the board was clean, I washed my hands, grabbed the bottle of wine, and walked into the adjacent study. The room was paneled in dark wood, dominated by a massive, live-edge walnut desk. I set my glass down, opened my duffel bag, and pulled out my work laptop. Flipping the lid open felt like disarming a bomb. I was the chief financial officer for Apex, Arthur's logistics company. It was a title he gave me, in lieu of actual equity, mostly so he could blame me when his reckless spending nearly bounced the payroll checks. The screen flickered to life. I connected to the chalet's secure Wi-Fi and opened my email client. 87 new emails in the work inbox. All of them from Arthur, and all of them frantic. I ignored the ones demanding I call him. I scrolled down to an email sent 3 hours ago. CCing Mitchell, the company's ruthless, overpriced corporate attorney. Subject: immediate termination and asset recovery. Nora, you have lost your mind. Effective immediately, you are terminated from Apex. Furthermore, I am initiating a full audit of the company accounts. You used $70,000 of company funds to book a private jet today. That is corporate embezzlement. Mitchell is preparing the paperwork. If you do not wire the funds back to the operating account by midnight, I am calling the authorities and having you arrested the moment you land back in the States. A cold, bitter laugh scratched its way out of my throat, echoing in the quiet study. He was trying to corner me. He assumed I was still the terrified, compliant girl who would frantically sell off her own stock portfolio to cover his tracks and beg for her job back. He actually thought he could frame me for embezzlement. I took a slow sip of the Cabernet, savoring the dark, peppery finish. Then, I placed my fingers on the keyboard. I didn't reply to Arthur. I hit reply all, ensuring Mitchell received my response directly. Mitchell, I typed, my fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic precision. Please find attached the receipt for the private charter, paid in full from my personal Chase Sapphire account. You will also find attached the complete ledger of Arthur's personal expenses, billed to the Apex corporate card over the last 24 months, totaling $412,000. This includes his country club dues, Diane's vehicle lease, and the offshore transfers to the Cayman entity he failed to disclose during last quarter's board meeting. I paused, attaching the heavily encrypted zip files I had prepared months ago. Files I had hoarded out of a paranoid, subconscious fear that he would one day throw me under the bus. In my past life, I had deleted these files the night before I died, feeling guilty for doubting him. I formally accept my termination. I continued. Effective immediately, I am revoking my personal guarantee on the corporate credit line with Bank of America. The bank has been notified. Without my credit score and asset collateral, the line will be frozen at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. Best of luck with payroll on Friday. I didn't add a sign-off. I didn't add an emotional plea. I hit send. The progress bar at the bottom of the screen zipped across, and with a soft, digital whoosh, the email was gone. I sat back in the leather office chair, staring at the screen. The financial backbone of Apex was entirely propped up by my pristine credit and my personal savings collateral. By revoking my guarantee, I had just triggered a cascade of financial defaults that would bankrupt the company in less than a week. Arthur was going to lose the business, the house, and the luxury cars. My hands started to shake again, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap, the sound slicing through the quiet room. The bridge wasn't just burned. I had detonated the entire foundation. Morning arrived, not with a gentle glow, but with a brutal, blinding strike of sunlight, bouncing off the snowpack and piercing the gaps in the heavy study curtains. I woke up with my cheek pressed against the cold leather of the desk pad. I hadn't moved since closing the laptop. My neck was fiercely stiff, a dull, rhythmic ache throbbing at the base of my skull, and my mouth tasted faintly of old pennies and sour wine. Slowly, I pushed myself up from the chair. My joints popped in the quiet room. I ran a hand over my face, feeling the dry, tight pull of my skin. It was 3 p.m. in Switzerland, which meant it was 9 a.m. in New York. The bank doors were open. The credit lines were officially frozen. I reached for my phone, lying face down on the corner of the walnut desk. I didn't want to look at it. My stomach executed a familiar, nauseating flip. The ghost of the girl who lived to serve Arthur's bottom line was still kicking around in my ribcage, terrified of the punishment that was surely coming. I squeezed my eyes shut, forced a sharp breath through my nose, and flipped the phone over. The screen was a graveyard of notifications. Mitchell, the corporate lawyer, had sent 14 emails in the span of an hour. The subject lines devolved from urgent, asset guarantee inquiry to Nora, call me immediately, Arthur is hospitalized. I stopped scrolling. My thumb hovered over the glass. Hospitalized. The word punched the air straight out of my lungs. A sharp, icy spike of guilt drove itself directly into my sternum. I tapped the email, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped the device. Nora. Mitchell's email Ed. The bank froze. The payroll accounts at 9:01 a.m. Arthur suffered a severe panic attack in the lobby of his hotel when his corporate card declined. Paramedics were called. He is currently at a local clinic in Geneva, under observation for elevated blood pressure. Diane is hysterical. You have made your point. Reverse the guarantee revocation immediately, or I will have no choice but to pursue criminal negligence charges. I stared at the glowing text. A suffocating silence pressed against my ears. My father was in a hospital. Because of me. Because I had finally taken my hands off the pillars holding up his rotting empire. A heavy, jagged breath scraped my throat. I backed away from the desk, my bare feet stumbling over the thick Persian rug. I hit the wooden bookshelf and slid down to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. This was the trap. This was how they always won. Whenever I tried to set a boundary in my past life, whether it was taking a weekend off or asking to be repaid for a loan, someone suddenly had a crisis. Chloe would have a mental breakdown. Diane would threaten to leave. Arthur would have chest pains. They weaponized their fragility to ensure I never stopped being their shield. And right now, every ingrained, pathetic instinct I possessed was screaming at me to log into the banking portal, reinstate the credit line, and wire Mitchell whatever he needed to make Arthur's blood pressure go down. I closed my eyes. The scent of the Swiss cedarwood faded, replaced entirely by the memory of sterile, chemical antiseptic. I saw the fluorescent lights of the ICU. I heard the erratic, agonizing beep of my own failing heart monitor. I remembered the exact, bone-chilling texture of the thin hospital blanket as the nurse gently informed me that my father had declined to come to the trauma ward because he was handling a critical supply chain crisis. I had died alone with shattered ribs while he sat in a comfortable office, ignoring my calls. My eyes snapped open. The icy spike of guilt in my chest melted, instantly evaporating into a blinding, searing wave of absolute clarity. He wasn't having a heart attack. He was throwing a tantrum because he couldn't pay for his luxury rental car. I stood up. My legs weren't shaking anymore. I walked back to the desk, picked up the phone, and deleted Mitchell's email. I didn't reply. I didn't block him. I just swiped left and sent it to the trash. I did the same to the 80 new text messages from Diane calling me a murderer. I swiped left on Chloe's demands for an apology. I walked out of the study, leaving the phone face down on the desk. I was done looking at screens. I went upstairs, stripped off the oversized sweater, and put on my own clothes. A pair of fitted, insulated ski pants, a heavy, dark green thermal turtleneck, my favorite leather boots, the ones I had bought for myself with my first real bonus, before Arthur convinced me to funnel my earnings into his offshore accounts. I grabbed my heavy winter coat, walked downstairs, and stepped out the front door. The cold hit me like a physical reset button. It was brutally sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and melting snow. The sky was an impossible, aching shade of blue. I didn't take a car. I walked down the steep, winding driveway, my boots crunching heavily into the packed ice. I walked all the way down into the village of Verbier. The streets were alive with noise, skiers clanking their poles against the cobblestones, the rich, buttery smell of raclette cheese melting from a street vendor's cart, the sound of French and German mixing in the crisp air. It was chaotic, loud, and incredibly beautiful. I found a small, crowded cafe with steamed-up windows. I walked inside, the bell above the door ringing cheerfully. I ordered a hot chocolate, not an espresso, not a bitter black coffee to fuel another 60-hour work week, but a ridiculous, excessive hot chocolate topped with a mountain of fresh cream. I took my mug and sat at a small wooden table outside on the patio, facing the sprawling expanse of the Alps. The ceramic was warm against my bare palms. I took a sip. The rich, velvety sugar coated my tongue, entirely drowning out the residual taste of stale wine and anxiety. I looked up at the mountains, massive and indifferent to the petty squabbles of the humans crawling over them. The accident that would have crushed my lungs was 3 years away, but it was never going to happen. I wasn't going to be driving that specific car on that specific highway, rushing to fix one of Arthur's manufactured emergencies. I had detonated my old life. The fallout would be messy. There would be lawsuits, screaming matches through lawyers, and a lifetime of being painted as the villain in Diane and Chloe's cocktail party stories. I didn't care. Let them have the narrative. I had my life back. I leaned back in the wooden chair, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and for the first time in 32 years, I took a deep, full breath that belonged entirely to me. If Nora's journey to break free from a toxic family struck a chord with you, remember this. You don't need a literal rebirth to start canceling the tickets of people who only use you for the ride. Setting boundaries is messy, painful, and rarely looks like a clean Hollywood victory. But your peace is worth the fallout. If you love this deeply grounded, raw approach to a revenge story, please hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder to protect their own energy, and subscribe for more stories about taking your life back. Leave a comment below. Would you have let them in?